Hi everyone, I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm Steph from Simply Rhino, and I'd like to welcome you to the second webinar in our series, which is focusing on the use of VRay 2.0 for Rhino. This second webinar will examine two distinctly different studio setups with VRay 2 for Rhino. A configuration using image-based lighting with the VRay Dome Light via VRay Express will be demonstrated before moving on to the creation of a traditional photographic studio set using VRay rectangular lights with no GI Skylight contribution. Controlling exposure with the VRay physical camera will be demonstrated along with using the VFB channels to aid post-production. The webinar should last approximately 30 minutes and our presenter is Phil Cook. Phil is an experienced product design professional and senior trainer here at Simply Rhino. He is responsible for our advanced and bespoke training. We do of course supply this software, Rhino, VRay for Rhino and all other key plugins for Rhino. We are one of the leading suppliers of these tools in the world. This success is mainly due to our depth of product knowledge. You will find that we only sell products we can support to an expert level. This focus makes us different. We offer training too, both tailored project or company-specific workshops, and also public scheduled classes throughout the year. We will be happy to hear from any of you in the weeks, months or years to come with any Rhino-related software or training requirement. The third webinar in this series is in 4 weeks' time on Wednesday the 24th of September. Details on what we intend to cover are on the webinar series page of the Simply Rhino website. Registration will open soon. This webinar is being recorded so you can watch it again. It will be posted on our YouTube channel. We'll update everyone as soon as it's available to view. As we progress through today's presentation, please do type any questions you may have and send to us. This is the method of asking your questions. You may have an answer directly within the chat or it may be shared with the group later. There will be an official Q&A session following the software presentation. Lastly, I'd like to say a quick thank you to Chaos Group, Scan Computers and PMY for their assistance. That's all from me for now, so let's hand over to Phil for the presentation. Phil, over to you.
Morning everybody, I'm Phil from Simply Rhino, and this morning we're going to take a quick look at a couple of different ways that we can set up studio scenes inside of VRay for Rhino. So the two setups that we're going to look at are first of all to produce a fairly sort of straightforward studio image, the sort of image that you would want to use if you were maybe a product designer looking at doing a fairly straightforward representation of the product with accurate materials and illumination, or to do something slightly more atmospheric. And for the former, we're going to use image-based lighting with the VRay Dome Light, which is a fairly straightforward setup. And for these more atmospheric images, we're going to try to recreate what happens in a conventional photographic studio where ambient light is excluded and all the light comes from studio lights. VRay has some really nice lights that we can configure fairly easily that replicate the studio lights really well. So first of all, we're going to look at the image-based lighting method in VRay for Rhino. So if I can switch first of all to my Rhino here, we've got the camera model that we saw on the last webinar, and we've got a fairly basic setup going on here. So let me just explain the setup. We are at default settings other than the fact that we have a white skylight and a white environment. We have turned off the physical camera for this scene, and in terms of output here, we are just rendering at viewport size at the moment. We already have materials applied to this scene, and if I just turn on RT, for this scene here, we'll see that the materials are applied, but because we've got no ground plane or reflective environment, then everything looks rather uninspiring. So let's look at quickly loading in a couple of things that can start to make our scene look a little more worthwhile. So first of all, I'm going to load in a ground plane, and in this setup I'm going to use the VRay Infinite plane. Now this plane, when you see it in Rhino, actually has a finite size to it, but when this renders all the way to the horizon. This type of ground plane is good for a quick setup, but if you are doing something that is more detailed and anything that requires any mapping applied to it, then it's not a suitable type of system to use. But for a quick setup, it's very useful. Next up, I'm going to load in a VRay dome light. All of the VRay lights are contained in our VRay lights panel up here, which we can pull out from our VRay toolbar, and the dome light is this tool here. Now the metaphor for a dome light is a hemisphere, and we position where we want the center of the dome light and just drag out the cursor to give this dome light a size. Now it's important to understand that the dome light that we're loading in here is really just a metaphor. So the size of the dome isn't that important, and you'll see that the dome actually surrounding the scene here. So don't worry if the dome actually is smaller than some of the elements in your scene. It really is just a metaphor. So once we've loaded in the dome light, we can then pick the dome light, and we can go to our light properties, and you'll see here that we have the options of being able to load in a dome texture. Now before we do this, let's just go back to some slides here and just take a look at how the dome light actually works and the sort of images that we're going to load in. So in the last webinar we explained that there is a skylight component in VRay, and the dome light can be thought of as a sort of localized version of the skylight, with the exception that rather than with the skylight where the light is coming from uniformly from all over the hemisphere, if we use an image to light with, then we will have directional illumination. And the other big difference between the dome light and the skylight is that the dome light is real direct illumination, whereas the skylight is indirect illumination. So what that means is that the dome light will produce proper contact shadows, and it's fairly easy to produce clean results with it. Now when we apply an image to the inside of our hemisphere, we would generally use an HDR image. HDR stands for high dynamic range, and this is an image which can either be a representational or a figurative image such as this, or a slightly more abstracted studio image like this. The idea of the HDR image, the high dynamic range image, is that a normal image, if you looked at the brightness values or the grayscale values of it, would have a region of a range of let's say white being 1 and black being 0, and all the other tonal information would fit somewhere in the middle of those. In an HDR image, using that same metaphor, we can have brightness values that are greater than 1. So if in Photoshop, for example, we were to analyze the brightness values of these areas here, we would see that they had a value of greater than 1. And these bright areas on the image we can actually use to give directional light inside of VRay. Whether you would use a figurative or a more abstracted sort of HDR is entirely up to you, but as a very crude generalization, you might use a figurative HDR for architectural use, and when you had smaller products you might tend to use a sort of simplified version of a studio softbox scene, which is what this is. You'll also see that the images here are distorted, and they are distorted by a particular projection, in this case a spherical projection, which means that when they are mapped onto the dome light or indeed the environment, then the reflections and lighting will look as though they are coming from a real world scene. So let's get back to Rhino and let's apply the dome texture to the inside of our dome light. So we check use dome texture, and then we click on the M symbol here to get to our VRay texture editor. Now this is the same VRay texture editor that we use for textures at all levels in Rhino. So that would be materials, lighting, environment, all use the same texture editor. So here we need to click a type, so I'm going to choose bitmap, and then I'm going to navigate to a folder I have of HDR images, and I'm going to choose this one here, which is Studio 10. On these images here, you'll see I've got little previews which show me what the lighting looks like from these. I'm going to load that texture in. Now, an important step that I need to do here is to make sure that my mapping type here, my UVW mapping, is set to environment. You should do this whenever you're loading in a texture that you're going to use for either a skylight, a background, or a dome light. And the mapping type here should match the mapping type of the image itself. So we can load that in and then look at my RT image now. And you'll see that we're starting to see some more realistic illumination going on. So I'm going to, here, because we're not using the physical camera, I'm going to increase the brightness of the scene by increasing the brightness of the dome light. You can see here that as I change that multiplier for the dome light from 1 to 2, you can see the scene becomes brighter. Okay, now the other thing that you'll see here is that the dome light, the image that we use on the dome light, is visible in the background here. So if we want to make that not so, then we can go again to our dome light settings here, and we can check invisible. And now we'll see the white background that is created here in our environment tab. So again, very similar sort of way of being able to make the dome light invisible, very similar kind of setup to we were using or to we were introducing in the last webinar in the environment tab itself. So once we've got the dome light set up, it's very easy to, for example, change the texture in here. So let's just put a slightly different texture in here. And also, sorry, I should go back to this. If we want to actually rotate the image around the sphere. So in other words, we can move the bright areas around and change our directional lighting. We can do this by these rotational tools here inside the texture editor. So I'm just going to increase the brightness now, just slightly more here. Okay, you'll see that brightness increase here. And let's look at something else that we can do now. If I, for example, want to light with the dome light, but I want to have slightly different reflections than the dome light is giving me, then what I can do is two quick things. I can go to my VRay options. I can, in my reflection tab here, I can load in a texture map. So let's use another HDR image here, and let's use a slightly warmer scene here. So I can load this in. Again, check that this is set to environment. You can always preview here just to see what I get. No change here in VRay at the moment, but if I click on the dome light, go to my light settings, and I now uncheck Affect Reflections, then you'll now see the warmer tones coming into here, because my reflections now are not coming from the dome light, but they're coming from the environment. So you can see here there's quite a few levels that we can play with here, just in very simple terms. And really the dome light, the idea of the dome light is that it gives us a very, very quick way of creating illumination. We can already see here we're getting some nice good contact shadows going on, even though we've got a fairly sort of low quality preview that we're looking at the moment. So let's now just go back to shaded mode here just for a moment, and I'm going to now go to my materials editor, and I am going to create a new material in here to add to the infinite ground plane. So to create a new material, I right-click on Scene Materials here, and I'm going to create a standard material. I'm going to give this a diffuse color of white, and I'm going to create a reflection layer and leave that at its fully gloss here, and I'm just going to change the name of this material so I can find it, and I'll call it white ground plane. Pressure's on here to make sure I spell this right. Okay, so white ground plane material, and we can preview that material here. And then to apply that to the ground plane, we apply material to selection. So I'm going to switch the way that I'm rendering here, and I'm going to just use the production renderer now, just to show you a couple of things that are going on in the production renderer. So again, it would help massively if I rendered the right view here, so let's do that. There we go. So again, we see the image, and we now see our reflective ground plane. Okay, so the image is fairly coarse at the moment. We're not that concerned about that, and we'll just let this render out before we go on to look at a couple of things that we can do to improve the studio scene. Okay, whilst this is rendering, one of the things that we can do to that we'll demonstrate later on, one of the things that we can do to reduce the amount of noise that's in the image is to increase the amount of subdivisions that are in the dome light. Now, it's important to understand that across the board in VRay, there are a lot of things that you can do with subdivisions. And one of the things to understand about subdivisions is that the number of subdivisions that is in the dialog box is actually the square root of the number of subdivisions. So the idea of subdividing means that you are breaking down either the image or the light or whatever you are subdividing into a number of areas to do separate calculations inside of those areas. So because the number that you input is the square root, 2 subdivisions looks like this, 3 subdivisions looks like this, and 4 subdivisions looks like this. So the idea is that you should be careful about how you increase the amount of subdivisions and not go too over the top with the number of subdivisions when you want to refine the image. Also, there are some areas in VRay that we'll look at later on in the webinar series where actually increasing subdivisions locally is probably not a good thing to do. With the dome light, it's certainly a good workflow. So we've got our baseline image here. Now, one of the things that we can do when we have the production renderer is we can use the region render button here. And I'm just going to take a small area here and look at a couple of things that we can do with the ground plane material. One of the problems, of course, if you have a reflective ground plane material is that ground plane is going to reflect the environment, which in this case is our slightly warm HDR. Now, if we want to make the ground plane look more neutral, so it has more in common with the background, then there is an interesting thing we can do with the material here. So I'll go back to my ground plane material, and you'll see that here I can actually override the reflection and on a per material basis. And if I use what's called a text A color here, and I set this to white, then what should happen now is that I'll get a white reflection from the ground plane rather than the environment. So when we come to render, you'll see now that we've lost that color cast from the environment. So this is a really useful thing to do when you are quickly setting up a studio scene. Next thing that we can do is that, and one of the things that you might well do in post-production is to actually have the reflection fall off here, so the reflection doesn't get traced its full depth here. Again, this can be done on a per material basis, so I can go back to my material, scroll up here to my reflection layer, and I can enable here what's called a dim distance. I can set a distance here over which the reflection is going to be traced, and then a value here, which is essentially a value from 0 to 1, where I want that distance to actually fall off. Again, if I render this image now, you should now see that that reflection now just gradually fades out over a distance. So pretty nice way of being able to control an environment. So you can see now that with very little work we've been able to get a kind of a white studio environment with a reflective floor where we can reduce the amount of reflection here with the dim distance, and we can cull the color cast and the background, the environmental reflection from the ground plane by overriding it. Let's just quickly look at trying to reduce some of the noise here. Let's maybe look at this area here and increase the subdivisions here of our dome light to something like 24, and just render a small area again here, and then I'll zoom in and we should be able to see the difference in the noise. In fact, you can see the difference in the noise already here. That let's actually do it down here as well, so you can compare like for like, and then I'll zoom in. Okay, so if I just turn this off and just zoom in here, you can clearly see how that noise is being cleared out. So one of the nice things about the dome light is that when you increase the number of subdivisions, as long as you do this carefully, the render times don't go up too much, so that we can get a very, very clean render very, very easily with the dome light. So let's look now at creating a slightly different type of image by using the VRay rectangular lights. And the sort of setup that we might use for this would be slightly different. So if we can go to our VRay options here, what I would choose to do here is to make sure that the physical camera is turned on. This is actually turned on by default in VRay 2.0, and I'm going to turn off the skylight and the reflection, the background as well. So we've got no ambient or environmental lighting going on whatsoever here. And needless to say, if I was to produce an RT render of this, we're going to see essentially nothing, because we've got no lighting going on in the scene. So I've actually got some rectangular lights already set up and a floor already set up here, just so we can quickly explain how these works. Now the floor that we've got set up here is just a sort of a revolved surface that our camera is sitting inside of, and it's much more controllable when you are creating a product to use some sort of geometry as a studio floor or a background, rather than using the infinite plane. And I'm going to turn on some rectangular lights here which are set up, and just take a quick look at an RT render now. So now we've got the physical camera on, and we've got the RT render on with our rectangular lights, and you can see that we've got the beginnings of a scene which might start to look interesting here. Now, the rectangular lights here are fairly easy to configure. I'll explain in a moment how one might create a rectangular light from scratch. But the lights are fairly easy to configure and understand. So when the lights are at their default scalar settings, then the size of the light is proportional to its brightness. In other words, at a given multiplier, in this case 20, if I were to make this light twice as big, then it would be twice as bright, and if I make it half as big in terms of its surface area, let's say, then it would be the same amount less bright. So in terms of surface area, if I made it a quarter of the size in surface area, then it would be a quarter as bright. And you can see this just very crudely here, that if I, for example, go to scale 3D and I scale this light here, make it smaller, then you'll see the brightness of this scene change here. Now, you can apply images or textures to the rectangular lights, but here we have just got some coloration, and it's important with that if you are going to apply any colors to the light, that really these colors should be very, very, very pale. You'll see that even though we've got a kind of a barely discernible color now, we're still getting quite a lot of color cast coming into this scene. Now, a setup that quite a lot of people use is they'll use one warm rectangular light here and maybe a cooler rectangular light coming in from the side. and then this one, which is illuminating from the back, is neutral. Generally, this idea of having 3 rectangular lights is quite a good setup to start off with. We have one light which is the kind of main light, then we have a light which is putting in some sort of feature lighting, and then a light from behind to just pick up the edges of the object, so that this improves the kind of three-dimensional nature of the scene. So while we're at this stage here, let's just take a quick look as well at the physical camera and how we might use this to control exposure. So when the physical camera is on, by default this exposure setting here is checked, and we can control the exposure by one of 3 means. We can use the shutter speed here, we can use the F number, and we can use the film speed. So in terms of the shutter speed here, what we're seeing here is the inverse of the shutter speed. So 30 is equivalent to 1/30th of a second. And all of these controls here behave exactly the same as on a 35mm film or 35mm digital camera. So 30th of a second, if we increase that to 1/60th of a second, then we'll be letting less light into the scene, and our exposure becomes less. F number here, this is using real values here, so if we put in a value here of, let's say, F4, then it would let in twice as much light as F8. Now, because the F numbers and the shutter speeds are sometimes kind of hard to work out the distinctions and the steps between them, the film speed is much easier to work out. The film speed is a fairly easy setting. We know that if we increase the film speed, for example, to 200, then we're letting twice as much light into the scene, and if we reduce the film speed from 100 to 50, then we're letting half as much light into the scene. So it's very, very easy to use that. We don't have the issue that we have with real cameras here, where using a high ISO will give us more noise. So for example, if I just wanted to boost this exposure slightly, then I could set the film speed here to maybe 110, and this should slightly brighten this scene here. Doesn't make a lot of difference, but let's increase this by a little bit more here, just to prove a point. Okay, and let's set that back for the next step. Okay, so let's look now at some other properties of the rectangular light. In fact, before we do that, let's just temporarily hide this light here, and when we do this, you'll see that our scene dims. And let's have a look at how we create a rectangular light from scratch. So we do this from our lights toolbar here, and let's just this is the icon for rectangular light, and we essentially first of all draw a rectangle, and we describe this by describing its 2 sides, and this rectangle will have a vector. Okay, let's just pull this forward here. Now, if we want to change the vector direction here, we can do the normal Rhino thing of picking the object and just typing in flip and enter, and you'll be able to change the vector. You can do this in Rhino to flip the direction of anything. You don't need to actually go into the menu, direction menu. You can just type flip. So good way of setting up the rectangular lights is to do this in the ortho views here. Just switch these to wireframe so I can see what's going on, and push this rectangular light about here and gradually manipulate this into position. Okay, now the rectangular light usefully now has got snaps to it, so I can use any of the tools here, rotate, scale, etc., and it's pretty easy to get the rectangular light pointing at our target object here. Now, one thing to be a little wary of is that by default in version 2 of VRay for Rhino, the rectangular light is set to an intensity of 30, which is probably much brighter than you would need in a scene like this. So let's just load this up again, and we should see now that we are getting something close to we had previously. Okay, so this was with our new light here. So again, what you will find with the multipliers of these lights here is that they are fairly subtle. So if here, for example, we've gone from 6 to 8, we don't see a massive difference in the illumination. Whereas if you are using some other multipliers in VRay, they are less subtle than this. So rectangular lights are fairly subtle, and that makes them really useful for creating a studio scene. Okay, the other thing that's important with the rectangular lights is that if I just zoom out here, is that by default they are not set as being invisible, so they will get in the way of the camera. So we need to check the invisible tab here, and then that light becomes invisible. Just a few of the other properties here. Affecting diffuse, specular, and reflections. Affect diffuse means the color of the light will affect the color of the object here. Affecting specular will mean that we'll see the result of the light in the specular highlights, and reflections mean that we'll actually see the rectangular light, there it is here, in the reflections of the object. We'll look at some of these other properties when we come to look at some of the architectural setups in VRay for Rhino. So let's just look at a couple of other very quick things now to make this scene slightly more atmospheric. And one of the things that we can do here is to use let's actually create this material from scratch here, is to actually create a black material which again can be reflective. So let's again just create this material here. So we'll create a standard material. We'll make this black. We'll create a reflection layer. Give this a name as well. And we'll use the dim distance setting that we were using before. Just preview this, and then let's apply this here. And you'll see that once we start to do this, we are getting a result which is much more atmospheric. And this is the type of result that is pretty hard to actually achieve with using the image-based dome light scenario that we were looking at before, and it's actually much easier to achieve this effect using the rectangular lights and mimicking what happens in a real photographic studio. So just as in most renders, a lot of what's creating the interest here is in the background itself. One of the things to note here is that in VRay RT, the cutoff of the of the dim distance is shown in a much more simplified way than it is in the production renderer. Finally, one other thing that we can do here is that we can use the depth of field here in our scene, and we can set this by going to our camera, turning on depth of field, and I'm using actually a slightly newer version of VRay, which is a development version, which hopefully will be a service release in the not too distant future. But I believe this button is in VRay 2.0 shipping version, and this is allows me to set the focus point here for my depth of field, and I can just pick on an object here and set the focus point, and I can control the blurring by setting the aperture here, the number of subdivisions, and I can also control the bokeh effects here, which are the kind of distortions in the blurring. So probably best just to show you on a slide how this looks when we achieve this effect here. Is that here I set the focus point on the mode dial here, and you can see either side of this we've got some nice blurring going on. So on an image like this, you know, this ability to have quite a narrow depth of field, quite a shallow area that's actually in focus, can again give us quite a nice image. So pretty much that's what I wanted to go through today. So I hope that's been of interest, and look forward to receiving any questions. So I'll hand you back for the moment to Steph.
Thanks, Phil. That's great. I'm going to hand over now to Paul from Simply Rhino, and he's just got a couple of questions, I think. So, Paul, can I hand over to you, please? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that, Phil. Just two questions. First one from Luke. How do you make a representational HDR image for spherical mapping?
Okay, so a lot of the images that, well, all of the images that we've used here are actually just obtained online. If you want to create your own HDR image, which I guess is what Luke is asking, then you need to do two things. You need to start with, if you're actually creating your own image from your own digital pictures that you've taken with the camera, then you need to start with a raw digital image, and you probably need to have the same image at different exposures. You combine those images together, and you can do this in Photoshop using an HDR function, which will combine those images into one HDR image. The idea of merging the separate exposures is that you get all the brightness levels from underexposed and overexposed areas in one file. The tricky bit is that you need to use some software to actually distort that image into the spherical projection or another or one of another types of commonly used projections that will allow it to map onto the inside of the dome light. If you don't want to use your own images, then you could consider something like HDR Light Studio, which we are going to look at later on in the webinar series. And the idea of this is that you can basically start with an image and you can add lights and edit this image on the fly whilst you are using it to work with. So that might be another way that Luke could investigate creating his own HDRs.
Okay, just another question, one from Karina. are we going, in any of this series, are we going to take an individual look at jewellery examples? Is that going to happen at any later date?
Yes, I say yes. We could do, I think. We are going on to materials next, and then architectural scenes. I guess when we do the sixth webinar, which is looking at HDR Light Studio, that might be a suitable time to look at a jewellery example.
Okay. Okay, and I think the last question, and I'll just say that any questions that have been sent that haven't been answered right now, we will be emailing you and contacting you about any questions. But just last one, Phil, for you. How do you control the number of pre-passes for a render? It's a question from Rob.
Okay, so the pre-passes are controlled here. Let's just go into our VRay options here. So if you have, as we have here, using irradiance map and brute force, then the pre-passes that we can control here are in irradiance map, and they're set with these two values here, minimum rate and maximum rate. So it's the difference between these two that gives you the number of pre-passes. The suggestion is that you don't ever have a difference of more than 5 between the minimum and the maximum rate. The idea of having a maximum rate of, in this case, -2, is that we are always undersampling, so we are speeding up the render. And if we wanted to increase the quality, then we could increase this maximum rate up to a maximum value of +1. So this is how you can control the number of pre-passes.
Okay. Okay, there were a few more questions, but I'm sorry that we've run out of time. But as I said, we will contact you. So I'm just going to say thank you to Phil, and then just hand back to Steph for the farewell.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, guys. That's great. So if anyone has got any further questions relating to anything from today, then please do email us and we will get back to you. The next webinar, as I said at the beginning, is on Wednesday the 24th of September, where we'll be looking at materials overview. And hope to see you all then. Thanks very much and goodbye.